Great. So this is Sue Watkins. I am the Climate Change Program Manager with the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals at Northern Arizona University. Thank you for joining the webinar. This webinar series is exploring climate change in the Pacific Northwest and impacts to tribes in the region. We're offering the webinars with support from the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station and in collaboration with the research station, the Pacific Northwest Tribal Climate Change Project at the University of Oregon and the North Pacific Landscape Conservation Cooperative. Next slide. Today's webinar will focus on climate change and invasive species and pests, and specifically Jeff Hickey at the University of Idaho will be discussing bark beetles in forest ecosystems. Unfortunately, our other presenter, Julian Olden from the University of Washington, had to cancel. He was going to talk about invasive species in freshwater ecosystems. The last webinar of the series is scheduled for next week, Wednesday, June 4th, and we'll be having more discussion on impacts of climate change on forests in the Pacific Northwest. This webinar is being recorded, and the presentations will be posted on ITEP's Climate Change Webinars webpage. I put the URL in the chat box. And please type your questions into the chat box or the question box, and after the presentation, Jeff will answer questions. Please mute your lines to reduce any background noise. And following the webinar, you'll receive a link to a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to provide feedback and suggestions of topics for future webinars. Next slide. Here is my contact information and also contact information for Christina Gonzalez-Maddox, who works with me in the Climate Change Program. ITEP's Climate Change Program offers trainings on climate change adaptation planning, webinars, a tribal climate change newsletter, and the Tribes and Climate Change website, and much more. We encourage you all to visit ITEP's Climate Change Program website at the URL shown on this slide. And please feel free to contact either Christina or me if you have any questions about ITEP. We're very pleased to have Jeff Hickey with us for the webinar. And Christina, if you could switch the controls over to Jeff, that would be great. And I will introduce Jeff. Jeff Hickey is an associate professor of geography at the University of Idaho. He studies the impacts of climate change on plants and animals, and he is especially interested in the interaction of climate change, forests, and disturbances such as insect outbreaks and wildfire. He received his PhD from the University of Colorado at Boulder in 2000 and moved to the University of Idaho in 2006. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jeff. If you unmute yourself, we should be able to hear you.
Okay, how's that?
Good.
Okay, so I'll start. You should be able to see my first slide.
Jeff, maybe a little louder. For me, it sounds kind of quiet.
Okay, how's that? Is that better? So you should be able to see my first slide. I'd like to first thank Sue and Christina for giving me an opportunity to speak to you, and thank you all for attending. As was mentioned, I'll be talking about climate change and bark beetles, specifically in the Pacific Northwest, but also more generally in the western U.S. and western North America. I'll be showing a lot of studies from different people, including my lab and my collaborators, and so I'd like to acknowledge them right up front. Arjen Meddens, Eric Creedon, and Polly Biet are all from my lab. Agnieszka Preitzer is a statistician, mathematician with Forest Service, and Ken Raffa is an entomologist with the University of Wisconsin. So I'll say right away that these bark beetle species that are attacking lots of trees in the western U.S. are not invasive species. They've been part of these forest ecosystems for millennia, But climate change has seemed to cause some unusual behavior and patterns in some of these forest disturbances, which I'll get into. Here's an outline of what I'm going to discuss. I'll first go into an introduction that describes some of the extent of these outbreaks as well as some of the mechanisms. Then I'll discuss recent outbreaks and how climate change, how we think climate change has affected them. Thirdly, I'll talk about the impacts to human and natural systems of this widespread tree mortality. Fourth, I'll talk about what the future holds given future climate change. And last, I'll go into a few management options. So to start the introduction part, this slide shows a map on the left of bark beetle caused tree mortality. The colors correspond to the percent of a 1 kilometer square grid cell. And the warm colors show areas where tree mortality has exceeded 30 to 50%. So you can see the major outbreaks in reds in British Columbia and in parts of western Montana and Idaho down into Colorado and throughout New Mexico and Arizona. So there have been extensive mortality from these beetles in most of the forests of western North America. On the right is a time series back to 1997 of these the tree mortality associated with these events. The top panel shows the year-by-year amounts. If you focus on the bottom panel, you can see that this is the cumulative mortality. And I'll just draw your attention to the amount of mortality in British Columbia, which is shown with the red square, the squares and the dashed lines. And in 2010, that was over 5 million hectares, which corresponds to about 12 million acres of tree mortality. And before I go further, I should note that this mortality area is the area occupied by killed trees. It's not the affected area that's often reported by the Forest Service and other agencies, because affected area includes live trees. And so we made an effort to net that down to just looking at the dead trees. Also shown in the lower part of the right panel is actually three estimates from the western U.S. The lowest estimate is the triangles. That is straight from the Forest Service aerial surveys. In the paper that's cited at the bottom, we also estimated an upper value. Those are the diamonds, because we noted from our studies of high-resolution aerial imagery and satellite imagery that the aerial surveys seem to be underestimating mortality. So we're also producing an upper estimate, and more recently we've produced sort of a middle estimate, which is the crosses and the dashed line. And that's what we think, the middle estimate is what we think is the most realistic value. And so you can see in the western U.S. in 2012 there was also about 5 million hectares of mortality. So these are extensive forest outbreaks, forest disturbances. And to give you a sense that there are many different outbreaks going on during this time frame, this map shows in different colors the different beetle species and different times of outbreaks. So the green is the major impact Mount Pine beetle outbreaks, and there's been a series of them from Colorado northward through British Columbia. But you can also see a lot of other species. Pinyon Ips beetle is in dark blue. Various engraver beetles, western balsam bark beetle, etc. have attacked forests throughout the western U.S. And so the point of this slide is that there's a variety of insect species that are attacking and killing trees throughout the western U.S., including the Pacific Northwest. And then just for context with respect to other forest disturbances, here I show you in red the same time series that I showed before, bark beetle outbreaks since about 1996 with 3 estimates. This time the y-axis is in units of carbon. That's just the amount of carbon in trees killed by bark beetles. And for reference, I'm also showing in blue the amount of carbon in trees killed by forest fires. So you can see there was a few major fire years, but overall bark beetles have killed more trees than forest fires. And so there are very important disturbances in the western U.S., especially in context of other disturbance agents like fire. Okay, and as a final part of the introduction, I'll give you some sense of some of the drivers or mechanisms that cause mountain pine beetle outbreaks. Focus on mountain pine beetle here because it's the best studied of the different bark beetle species, at least in the western U.S. And there are a variety of factors, and I'm going to just mention a few of them that tend to operate at larger spatial scales. So first, there's a set of factors related to trees. I showed you before that there, in the map, there was a variety of beetle species, and they're each affecting different host tree species. So within a stand, in order to get a beetle outbreak, you need that beetle's preferred host tree species. So that's the first thing. The next three items are related to the ability of a host tree to defend itself from attack, which it can do. But with high stem density, there's competition and stress on trees that limits their defensive capability. As trees age, they become less vigorous and therefore more susceptible to attack. And lastly, in the instance of a drought, either through high temperatures or lack of precipitation, the host trees become stressed and are also unable to defend themselves. So the first three of those are related to stand structure. And then there's a set of factors related to beetles. First, we need a nearby beetle source for the attacks. And second, there's a set of direct temperature effects on beetles through two mechanisms. One is at very low temperatures during wintertime or fall or spring, beetles can be killed as they are not, as they overwinter under the bark. So that's a winter beetle mortality effect. The second temperature effect is related to year-round temperatures, and these beetles tend to be under direct control of temperature in terms of their life stage development rates. So with higher temperatures, their life histories or life stage development speeds up, and they can complete their life cycles in 1 year instead of 2 or 3 years, and that allows populations to grow quite quickly. It also acts to synchronize populations for mass attack, which is the strategy that beetles use to overcome tree defenses. And this temperature effect on population synchronization and life cycles is termed adaptive seasonality. So you can see that the climate has influence on mountain pine beetle outbreaks in 3 different means: drought and 2 temperature effects. And this is generally true for many bark beetle species that have killed trees in the western U.S. recently. Okay, turning now to some of the recent climate influences on recent outbreaks. I'll talk about a few different phenomena. The first is we're seeing intensified outbreaks of beetles within areas that are historically within the range or distribution of these beetles. So the first example is mountain pine beetle in central Idaho. Entomologists Jesse Logan, Barbara Bentz, and their colleagues traditionally, or up to the mid-90s, studied mountain pine beetles in these regions because this region was too cold to support an epidemic. It could support very low populations, and these scientists were able to track and follow these populations as they moved around on the landscape. But starting in the 1990s and extending into 2000s, there was a warming period that led to conditions that were much more conducive to outbreaks, and therefore the mountain pine beetle populations erupted, and as you can see in the picture, caused extensive mortality in this region. So recent climate change has caused outbreaks to occur when typically outbreaks wouldn't have occurred. The second example is just the magnitude, the extent and intensity or severity of tree mortality associated with these outbreaks. And the example I'm going to show you here is from northern Colorado. This is a mountain pine beetle outbreak in lodgepole pine, just as it was in Idaho. And the map plots for each 30-meter Landsat pixel our estimate of the amount of mortality as a percent of that pixel. So the reds and deeper oranges indicate much higher mortality. And this is cumulative during the period of the outbreak from about 1996 forward. So you can see the spatial extent. The mortality occurred throughout much of the northern Colorado Landsat scene shown here. Of the total forest area in the Landsat scene, 22% experienced mortality. And we could also compute plot level or Landsat pixel level averages. And so for those pixels that experienced mortality, we found that the average mortality rate was 60%, which was pretty high, and that the mortality duration, the duration of attack, was 3 years, which is also pretty fast. So pretty extensive and severe mortality associated with this beetle outbreak. And another study done by Eric Creedon looked at the causes of this particular outbreak in Colorado, as well as 4 other mountain pine beetle outbreaks scattered throughout the western U.S. And so I'll just focus again on Colorado, which is the time series you can see in the upper right, and the map in the lower right. So what Eric did was to assess what the climate patterns were up to and throughout each of the outbreaks. So what's shown here are time series from 1900 to 2000 of a variety of metrics for the Colorado outbreak alone. The top panel shows you the number of trees killed in black, and in gray is also the number of trees killed on a logarithmic scale. The next panel down, labeled adaptive seasonality, is this effect of year-round temperatures. In this case, it's just March through August, the means. The third panel down shows you the winter minimum temperatures that can influence beetle mortality during winter. And the last plot, the lowest one down, that's labeled drought stress, is the Palmer Drought Severity Index. So you can see from the top plot that the beetle populations ramped up in the 2000s. And during that time period, both the year-round temperatures were high, as well as the winter temperatures warmed. So in that third panel, that arrow shows you that there was a lack of very cold conditions during the, say, from the 1990s forward. And that's different from the previous years, back to 1900, where this area experienced very low temperatures that probably kept populations in check. So here we see long-term warming that's associated with the Colorado outbreak. And this long-term warming, just to remind you, has been attributed to anthropogenic climate change through greenhouse gas emissions. In addition to the warming, there was a prolonged drought associated with both higher temperatures, but also with much reduced precipitation. And you can see that in the Palmer Drought Severity Index time series there. So both warming and drought were responsible for this outbreak, at least facilitated it from a climate standpoint. And I'll also note that the 4 other regions that was shown a few slides ago also experienced a similar set of conditions, longer-term warming coupled with drought. Okay, a final example associated with this intensified outbreaks has to do with the drought that I just mentioned, which facilitated outbreaks of less aggressive bark beetle species. So the mountain pine beetle is considered an aggressive beetle species because it can kill trees that are healthy. But there's a suite of other bark beetle species that typically rely on stress conditions to kill trees. So the photo on the left shows pinyon pines that were killed by a combination of severe drought in the 2000s and pinyon ips beetle outbreaks. And the map on the right is just a repeat of what I showed earlier, and I've indicated with those red arrows 4 or 3 other types of beetle species, Douglas fir beetle and 2 engraver beetle types, that also killed trees during this drought period. So we know that these droughts are warmer today than they have been in the past, and we think that has an effect both on the host condition that's more stressful for trees during warmer droughts, but also, as I mentioned, the temperature plays a role in influencing the beetle life stage development and their overwintering capability. So the fact that there are droughts, there have been droughts in the past, but these droughts today seem to be warmer and may have intensified or caused more severe outbreaks. Okay, then a second set of conditions or a second phenomenon is associated with migration or range expansion. The map here shows the mountain pine beetle on hatching, as well as one of its primary hosts in red, that's lodgepole pine, as well as in green, the distribution of jack pine, which is in the boreal forest typically of Canada or the eastern U.S. And you can see from the mountain pine beetle distribution that its northward boundary historically was not caused by a lack of host species. There's plenty of host lodgepole pine to the north. In fact, it was held in check by low temperatures. So there was a current concern back in 2001 when this paper was published by Jesse Logan and Jim Powell that the mountain pine beetle would expand its range north as associated with warming and begin to invade jack pine, which was demonstrated or has been demonstrated to be a viable host for these species, thereby allowing this particular disturbance agent, mountain pine beetle, to spread across Canada and into the eastern U.S. as well as eastern Canadian boreal forest. In fact, that's what's happened recently. This map shows in orange the mountain pine beetle outbreak that occurred, the mortality that occurred during 2002 to 2006, and the reds show more recent expansion to the north and to the east across Alberta. And today there are documented attacks on jack pine in eastern Alberta. So the predictions of Jesse Logan and Jim Powell seem to be holding up given continued warming both during wintertime and during year-round temperatures. So mountain pine beetle is expanding northward and causing a lot of concern with Canadian foresters. Okay, the last example I'll give is that we're seeing outbreaks in unusual habitats. And the case that I'll discuss is whitebark pine. Mountain pine beetle is not unprecedented in whitebark pine. We know there have been cases that have been documented through dendrochronology in the 1930s, for example. But today the extent of mortality is much greater than what's happened in the past. And so I want to just discuss that a little bit with a case study that my lab is involved in. So here's a map that shows the extent of high elevation 5-needle pines, which are mostly whitebark pines in the northern part of the map. The reds indicate the mortality areas, the grays are just the forest area. And you can see from the time series in the lower left that the affected area exceeded 200,000 hectares in 2009. So pretty extensive mortality. We were interested in studying this beetle outbreak in whitebark pine. Whitebark pine is recommended for listing as threatened and endangered, and climate change and its effects on the beetle were part of the reason for that listing. So we wanted to provide a bit more information to the Fish and Wildlife Service about what the climate has been doing in recent years, how it's been influencing this outbreak, as well as what it will do into the future, given future projections of climate change. So this is work led by Polly Biot, a student of mine. She divided the whitebark pine distribution in the U.S. into 3 regions, the Cascades, the Northern Rockies, and the Greater Yellowstone area, and is developing statistical models of the relationship between climate, mountain pine beetle, and whitebark pine in the region. And today I'll talk about the mortality that's happened in Greater Yellowstone as one of these regions. So again, our goals were to develop the models, statistical models. Here I show the, in black, the observations of presence or absence of mountain pine beetle and whitebark pine in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And in red, the red dots in the red envelope shows the means and uncertainty associated with our statistical model. So this just is to indicate the progression of the outbreak during our study period, as well as to show you that the model that we've developed is doing a pretty good job at representing the actual observed mortality. As a result of this model, we can use it to diagnose what's happened recently with respect to climate change. This is a time series that goes back to 1900 of something we're calling weather suitability index. Weather suitability index is the sum of the model terms associated with the climate variables or the weather variables, which in this case are the fall temperatures and the spring-summer temperatures, as well as the winter minimum temperatures and a measure of drought stress, which is summer precipitation. So we also have other variables that represent the number of attacking beetles, as well as some representation of stand structure. But for this particular question, we're interested in how the climate has changed and allowed this major outbreak to occur in the greater Yellowstone area. So you can see on the bottom, the dashed line indicates the outbreak area, which I just showed you in the previous figure. And the weather suitability index is plotted from 1900 to 2009. And the red lines show the range of weather suitability index during the period when the current outbreak was occurring. So the important point of this figure is you can see every few years that the weather suitability index was very low, -1, -2, which kept beetle populations in check. This was associated mostly with the winter minimum temperatures that were extremely low. But as was the case for the Colorado outbreak in lodgepole pine, here we're documenting the increase in winter minimum temperatures that have alleviated these very low conditions, very unsuitable conditions for mountain pine beetle in recent years. We also noted the importance of the drought that occurred in the 2000s to facilitate population increases. So we think that recent climate change has been responsible, at least in part, for this outbreak. We also were interested in running our model using climate change projections to see what would happen in the future. So this figure shows the changes in climate that were predicted by 10 different climate models. The x-axis shows the difference in winter minimum temperatures compared with 1950 to 2005. So there's the historical baseline. And the y-axis shows the difference in summer precipitation compared with that year. And there are three figures here. They're all associated with the highest rate of warming, highest emission scenario, RCP 8.5. And the leftmost figure is from 2025, and then the time period progresses to 2055 in the center, 2085 on the right. During all periods, all the models indicate or predict warming. You can see that all the symbols are in positive X direction, but there's quite a range of projections as far as summer wetting versus drying, and that plays a role in our projections. So we ran each model through our projections, and I'll show you the results here. So these are odds ratios or changes in the probability of mountain pine beetle outbreaks given climate change scenarios. There are three rows. One row, the top row, is associated with less emissions and less warming, and then the middle row is with somewhat more emissions, and the bottom row is the highest emission rate, RCP 8.5. And then the three columns correspond to the columns that I just showed you in terms of time. And what's plotted is a bar chart, or a bar, for each different model. And the way to read these are the 1.0 is that the probability is the same as what it's been in the last few decades in the greater Yellowstone area. And if the bars are higher than 1, that indicates higher suitability into the future. And if they're lower than 1, that indicates lower suitability. So there are two possibly counteracting forces going on here. One is the change in precipitation, and that's evident in the RCP 2.6 panel, the top panel, where some of the models that are wetter indicate less favorable conditions, lower suitability for beetles, whereas some of the models that are drier indicate higher suitability. But under the other scenarios, emission scenarios, the middle row and the bottom row, where warming is higher, our model predicts a higher favorability or suitability for mountain pine beetle outbreaks because the warming overwhelms any changes in precipitation. So overall, it's probably a bad time to be a whitebark pine in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Okay, so what about some of the impacts of this extensive mortality? Talk about impacts to natural systems and then human systems. So first, there are effects on subsequent wildfire. You can see the tree that's burning there is a red tree. So we know that there are likely to be effects, but we also know that these effects really depend on time since outbreak. And that's illustrated with these various stages of post-attack stands. So the red trees in the center top are within 3 to 5 years of attack. The needles are on the trees, but the trees are dead and the needles are very dry. So we think in this case, perhaps the crown fire potential is higher. The risk might be higher than a live tree, a stand with live trees. But as you progress to the lower right, and the needles fall off, the trees become gray, and as the trees themselves fall over, which is in the lower center panel, it turns out that the fuels in the canopy are reduced. So in fact, these gray and old stage forests or stands may be less risky in terms of crown fires at least, but may have more intense surface fires. So there's a combination of different types of fires as well as time-sensitive disturbance that lead to various responses in terms of whether beetle kill affects fires or not. Carbon management seems to be becoming important. This paper studied the net carbon flux, whether forests were carbon sources or sinks, in the British Columbia or from the British Columbia outbreak of mountain pine beetle, which is the map shown on the left there. The time series on the right plots the net carbon sink or net carbon flux, here labeled net biome production, where values greater than 0 indicate that this region was a sink of carbon from the atmosphere and less than 0 a source of carbon. Before the outbreak began, this region was a slight sink of carbon. It was soaking up carbon from the atmosphere. But because of all the dead trees, the lack of photosynthesis and uptake of carbon by growing trees, as well as the release of carbon from decomposing trees, this region switched to a strong source of carbon to the atmosphere and lasted for many decades. And the net amount of this release of carbon to the atmosphere was equivalent to 5 years of emissions from Canada's transportation sector. So the effect was pretty substantial and in fact caused changes in the Canadian response to the Kyoto Protocol, which managed greenhouse gas emissions. There are effects on wildlife as well. Just to illustrate a few associated with wildlife, I'll show you here. The bird is the Clark's nutcracker. It has a symbiotic relationship with whitebark pine. The bird gets a food resource. The pine gets its nuts distributed and planted in areas that are favorable for seedling establishment in open areas. With the extent of tree mortality, birds are going to go elsewhere and find other types of food. But whitebark pine is really dependent on the bird for seed dispersal. So we're not quite sure what's going to happen following this major event, at least in the greater Yellowstone area. Also in the Yellowstone area, there's a cascade of effects from whitebark pine mortality to the middens that gray squirrels use to cache the whitebark pine's cones. And these middens are then raided by grizzly bears. And up until recently, it was thought that grizzly bears really relied heavily upon this food resource for fattening up just prior to hibernation. And that idea has been called into question somewhat, but it does seem that bears do use this resource, and so this extensive mortality will at least force bears to behave differently. Turning now to effects on humans. First, there's obvious effect on resource extraction or timber production. British Columbia is running their mills 24/7 in order to take advantage of as many killed trees as possible before they rot on the stump. Of course, when that outbreak recedes or subsides, and when all the harvesting is done, then those communities there are going to have to rely on some other means for providing jobs. So there's some important economic, socioeconomic implications for the beetle outbreak in British Columbia. Of course, there's opportunities as well. This denim pine or blue-stained wood has become more prevalent in terms of paneling or furniture. And so some people are taking advantage of this, and perhaps some uses of biofuel in harvesting. There are other impacts to human uses of the forest. There's 100,000 lodgepole pines that were killed by mountain pine beetles fall in the forest every day. That's a lot of trees that are falling on power lines, on trails, on roads, on campgrounds, and so there's a lot of effort by the Forest Service and other land management agencies to reduce the consequences of this tree fall. So trails are being cleared, closed and or cleared. Trees are being cleared away from power lines, away from canals or roads in order to reduce the hazard. You can see the photos on the bottom indicate that the Forest Service has closed campgrounds in Colorado, and the photo in the lower right shows you what a campground looks like after the Forest Service has come through and removed these killed trees. So you can imagine that the camping experience might be a little different now, given that there's a clear cut. Okay, I mentioned in a few slides ago our studies of the effects of future climate change on whitebark pine. I want to generalize that a little bit now to other systems. First, I'll talk about work we've done in lodgepole pine with respect to mountain pine beetle. If you remember from the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that there is a set of variables associated with stand structure that lead to outbreaks. Here we used the Forest Service plot inventory network as well as a model to produce something we call the pine structure susceptibility index. So the high values, the warm colors here, which are located in Colorado, parts of Montana, and the Cascades, indicate conditions or locations where lodgepole pine is in a condition that's highly susceptible to attack by mountain pine beetle. So large diameter lodgepole pines, high stem density, older stands. Summed up across the western U.S., 47% of the lodgepole pine stands are in a condition that would result in about a third basal loss in the event of attack. So lodgepole pines are in conditions that are ripe for major outbreaks of mountain pine beetle. The Forest Service produced a National Insect and Disease Risk Map, which is shown here. The green areas are forested areas, and on top of those they plotted red areas where they estimated that the risk from insects and disease were pretty high in terms of about a quarter of the basal loss or volume loss within the next 15 years, if I remember. So these are all species of insect and pathogen, and all species of trees. And you can see that much of the western U.S., in particular much of the Northwest, the stands are in conditions susceptible to attack by some form of biotic disturbance agent. Okay, so that was the stand structure piece. Now what about the climate piece? We know climate is going to continue to warm. This is a figure from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the fourth assessment report, that shows, given sets of emission scenarios, continued warming. I show you what that manifested in terms of whitebark pine. But in general, we think that warming will lead to favorability for beetle outbreaks in terms of its direct influence on the beetles, as well as increased host stress. And also, at least in some areas, there will be summer drying that's projected by a majority of climate models. So here's a set of maps that indicate by season the changes in precipitation from the National Climate Assessment, which was just released a few weeks ago. You can see the Pacific Northwest in summer, where the red arrow is particularly vulnerable to reduced precipitation. That's exactly when our model of whitebark pine predicts is the important timing, seasonal timing of precipitation changes. So of course this leads to increased host stress and higher susceptibility to attack by beetles. A few models used by Barbara Bentz and published in 2010 also indicate the effects on various aspects of beetle ecology. So these two rows indicate model results for 61 to 1990 and 2071 to 2100. Those are the rows. The leftmost column is the model prediction for how quickly spruce beetles will develop given temperature. And you can see, if you compare the two, the top panel and the bottom panel, that the red areas, which are associated with high development rates, expand greatly in the coming decades, associated with warming. The middle panel shows the development rate of mountain pine beetle, and here you can see that the green areas, which indicate higher suitability, temperature suitability, tend to move around a bit on the landscape. It's not just a one-way directional increase. And the rightmost panel shows you the winter survival probability of mountain pine beetle given winter temperatures. And like for spruce beetle, you can see that the areas of orange, yellow, and red expand greatly in the coming decades. So these all are models that indicate some aspect of the effect of temperature on these two beetle species, and they indicate that there will certainly be changes and often favorable for the beetles. Okay, so the last section here, I'll talk a little bit about management options. The first option is to help potential host tree species or host trees. I mentioned as a few slides ago and repeated from previously in the talk that stand structure plays an important role. So if you can diversify the species distribution or species mix on your landscape or increase the diversity of ages, then it's likely that future forests will be a little more resilient to beetle attack because beetles prefer a certain host species and prefer older trees. So you can do that, of course, with various methods, including harvest or selective thinning in some cases, or by letting wildfires burn, those sorts of things, planting. At the tree level, there's ways of increasing the defensive capacity of some tree species, such as ponderosa pine, by thinning. That allows for reduced competition and increased resources, and therefore increased defensive capacity. And then by reducing future climate change, we might allow host trees to also be less stressed. There's also ways of reducing beetle populations, perhaps. One is to continue to monitor and respond rapidly after detecting beetle outbreaks. Some beetle species, such as spruce beetle, build their populations in other disturbance types, such as windthrow, and so by monitoring insect populations in those areas that experience windthrow, one could perhaps manage a beetle population by removing infested trees. At the tree level, there's demonstrated pesticides that kill beetles, but of course they're very labor intensive and very expensive. There's also the means of putting out pheromone packets that seem to repel beetles. Both of those are, as I said, intensive in terms of time and energy. And then, of course, we can reduce future climate change through greenhouse gas emissions that will lead to reduced warming. A few other thoughts with respect to management. Tree mortality following even severe outbreaks is rarely complete. So forest recovery following beetle outbreaks is often faster than, for instance, a very severe crown fire. There's a component of the understory in terms of either smaller trees or non-hosts that remains following beetle outbreaks, and so as you can see from this picture, that there's a mixture of greens and red trees. It seems that early management interventions or proactive management interventions are best. These outbreaks are very difficult to stop once they're going. And landscape management seems to be best because beetles fly. They can fly several kilometers up to have several hundred kilometers. And therefore, considering a management strategy that includes a variety of lands that are not just your own local lands, but maybe considering a variety of landowners will have the maximum effect. And then these outbreaks have happened in the past, and we expect they'll continue in the future. So promoting acceptance among policymakers, among homeowners, seems to be prudent. While also identifying ways of planning for their impacts. Okay, so just to summarize and conclude, I showed you that beetles outbreaks cause extensive and severe tree mortality across the western U.S. and western North America. They're important forest disturbance agents. I showed you that we found that recent climate change seems to have facilitated these extensive outbreaks that have occurred in the last several decades through both increasing winter temperatures, increasing year-round temperatures, and through perhaps warmer droughts. There are extensive impacts to human systems through impacts on resource extraction, through recreational use of the forests, and to natural systems such as subsequent fire, to wildlife habitat, carbon management. Given our best projections of climate change, which include warming and in some cases drying, we expect to see continued tree mortality that's perhaps of the extent that we've seen in recent decades. And I showed you that some management options exist. They're particularly effective when considered at the tree scale or perhaps at a very local scale, but they're limited particularly when beetle outbreaks or beetle populations are very high, and or when there's quite a range of management strategies and land ownerships. So thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jeff. Let me see. There are no questions typed in yet, so I encourage people to type in your questions or even comments, maybe if you've seen insect outbreaks such as this in your area. It would be great to hear about that. And in the meantime, I have a question for you, Jeff. I was wondering what is a good website to get information about bark beetles and other insect outbreaks? Maybe a website that isn't overly technical, that
Sure.
has some useful information?
Yes, by just doing a search on the U.S. Forest Service puts out forest insect and disease leaflets, and they're beetle specific or species specific, meaning any type of insect or disease actually, and it provides a nice overview of that particular disturbance agents and how the trees, what trees are affected, and how what people can do about them. So by typing in fiddle, F-I-D-L, and then the beetle species or insect species or disease species that you're interested in, you can find those quite quickly and easily.
Okay, great. And then we have a question that was typed in. Do you think this past winter's bitter cold temperatures in Canada, the polar vortex, will have much of an impact on the spread?
Well, that's a good question. I haven't actually studied that or heard of people discussing that. It turns out that beetles can go through a process of cold hardening, and so they synthesize some antifreeze and therefore can withstand temperatures down to -40 degrees or so. So they can handle pretty cold temperatures, but the issue often is that they cannot synthesize these antifreeze compounds quickly enough, and so cold snaps that occur either in early fall or late spring will catch these beetles without their antifreeze, if you will. So I'm not answering the question directly because I don't know what the temperatures were in the locations of the leading fronts, if you will, of the Mount Pine beetle outbreak in Colorado and Canada. But unless they were, let's say, minus 30 degrees C or minus 40 degrees C for a few days, they wouldn't have an effect. So that's about all I know about that.
Okay, yeah, and that slide you showed was pretty alarming, seeing the potential for the beetle to spread all the way across Canada. What's your feeling about that happening? Do you think it's pretty likely it's going to happen and there really isn't too much we can do?
It does seem that way. The model projections don't suggest any cooling off period, and so though that area of boreal forest is going to become suitable for the beetles to occur, people are trying pretty hard to manage the outbreak, but I'm not sure they're being successful at that. So I'm not sure about, I don't think the jack pine is a huge component of the boreal forest in many places, so you won't see red trees from east coast to west coast of Canada. But I think given the climate conditions that we expect to occur in the near future, I would suggest that we will see some mortality in the coming decades in those areas.
Okay. We have another question that came in. How much has historical forest practices had a negative effect on making matters worse for tree mortality, i.e. replanting only one species, having a monospecies, large clear cuts, removing salmon that replenished forest soils, etc.?
Well, so there's two parts to that. I think certainly the forests are set up now and were as of a few decades ago in terms of being in conditions that lead to this extensive mortality. So lodgepole pine in Colorado, for instance, was fairly even-aged, 100-year-old stands. Those are the conditions that the beetle likes, these older trees, high stem density. And that probably is the case for many different outbreaks in the western U.S. And then the second part of that seems to me, what was the cause of that? And I don't know the history behind a lot of areas, but I do know that land use, forest clearing for either mining operations to find minerals or for timber extraction, for power, or railroad ties, etc. There was a lot of harvest, clear cutting in the early parts of the 1900s or late parts of the 1800s that likely led to the conditions of the forest today.
Okay, thank you. I do not see any other questions. If anyone has a last question, here's your chance to get it to Jeff. Otherwise, we're going to be wrapping up in a minute. Let's see. Oh, I see another question that maybe was part of an earlier one. I'm not sure. How much opposition does the Forest Service get from NGOs in bark beetle salvage operations? Would it be the same as, say, like a fire salvage sale?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with the interaction between Forest Service and NGOs in terms of this bark beetle salvage. It does seem to me like the same factors would apply to a salvage operation in beetle kill forests as they would in after a fire. But whether NGOs are specifically targeting beetle killed forests for some special consideration, I just don't know the answer to that.
Okay, and we have another question. How about coastal forests compared to inland forest outbreaks? Are there any differences observed?
Yeah, it doesn't seem like the coastal forests, particularly the Pacific Northwest, are much affected by beetle outbreaks. Maybe insects in general. So western spruce budworm doesn't appear very much in the coastal forests. That's probably due to a variety of reasons. The climate might be less conducive to the beetle outbreaks. There might be less stress during the growing season of trees. And certainly the species composition plays a role. So in areas where you get one species like lodgepole pine extending over many thousands of acres, that's a pretty good table set for a beetle. But when there's a lot of a mixture of species, it's a lot harder for beetle populations to build in those kinds of forests. So I think probably both of those reasons, for both of those reasons, there seems to be less biotic disturbance damage in coastal forests.
Okay, I believe that's all the questions. So with that, Jeff, I just want to thank you for participating in this webinar and also for expanding on your talk at the last minute when we had the cancellation of the other presenter. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone who joined the webinar. And with that, we'll close it out.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.